So, I want to start off just by presenting this first question to the panel. How is Islamophobia, why should Islamophobia be an issue that concerns the 2020 election discourse as an American issue rather than simply an issue that impacts one faith community? And whoever would like to start on that.
I'll take that question. Well, having done work on Islamophobia not only in the American context, but also transnationally in Europe. I just came back from our 6th annual conference on Islamophobia in Europe. What we know that Islamophobia has been monetized at the ballot box. You could actually correspond the rise of right-wing political parties in Europe, in India, and even in the US or Canada, and you could correspond it with how the fear and Islamophobic discourse have been an instrument to drive right-wing political parties into the ballot box and win election. So the 2016 was very, very critical in a sense that Trump was very shrewd in how he monetized Islamophobia. How some of the ads that were targeting particular segments of the American society through Cambridge Analytica and Robert Mercer, these were targeted campaigns, knowing that it's much easier to mobilize people out of fear into the ballot box, as well as dissuade your opponent's voters from coming out in the election. Let me give the example of Poland. You will ask, why Poland? Well, because it's a very illustrative example. Poland now has one of the most intensive Islamophobic public discourse connected to election. It's actually an example of having Islamophobia where there is no Muslims, because the percentage of Muslim population in Poland is 0.03. You can't even have them to fill this convention hall, let alone being a threat to Poland or the Polish political discourse. But Poland, as it wants to assign itself as being part of Western society and Western civilization, the way to cast oneself as being part of Western civilization, you use the other. And the other in here is Muslims. And this connects us to the Clash of Civilization thesis of Huntington, where he said that we need to define ourselves by identifying whom we hate. In essence, hating Muslims is a way, and if you want the reference, it's page 20 in Huntington book, Clash of Civilization. So anybody who's actually doing research, you should do that. So in essence, Western civilization in the post-Cold War era is defining its internal solidarity by means of casting hate toward Muslims as a way of identifying this as a self. And my argument is that that's actually contrary to basic Christian theology. So Huntington is anti-Christian because the basis of Christian theology is love. So in here is actually putting Christian theology upside down. So again, is one way to think of how these individuals that are talking about defending Western civilization, which for many they argue that is based on Judeo-Christian tradition, when you take theology relative to the argument that they're making, is actually almost the opposite or upside down.
You're in DC, so you got to talk about those elections.
Okay. Just because I'm in DC, huh? Okay. Bismillah. Thank you. First, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you, Dalia, for hosting us. And I'd like to give really a shout out for ISPU. This is a very, very important organization. We have thousands of organizations nationwide, mosques, schools, social organizations. But ISPU is probably one of very, very few that produces facts, not emotions, facts, that enable us to do our work, to argue on your behalf, to fight on your behalf. So it deserves your support, your dua, and your engagement. Now to my answer. Thank you. Yeah. Why Islamophobia should be an American issue? Because it is designed to violate the civil rights, the religious rights, the constitutional rights of an American community. It should be of concern to all Americans. Those who care about the Constitution, what America means, should be worried. If this worry is only left for the Muslim community, then the Muslim community is failing and the country is failing. If we allow another community like the Muslim community to suffer in isolation, that means our nation is failing its principles. So that is why it should be an American issue. An election issue, also, it's going to be an election issue because, as Dr. Bazian said, Trump has elevated Islamophobia, has empowered Islamophobia, has legitimized Islamophobia, and has used it to divide Americans and has used it to scapegoat the Muslim community. The Muslim community is not the reason for the whites' anxiety about their future, but he's using what appears to be a vulnerable community like the Muslim community because it does not show on the political radar screen like other communities. So it is an easy target. Secondly, it's designed to silence and sideline the Muslim community. Well, he succeeded in dividing and winning. So, unfortunately, he did. But where he failed is he failed to scare the Muslim community. The Muslim community is not scared. The Muslim community ran to politics, did not run away from politics, and we had a record number of Muslims who ran for public office and won. And that is important. Yeah, so we're just engaging now, and it's not over. So you have to be engaged, you have to be aware, you have to build coalitions, and I am happy to see the observations and recommendations from ISPU. So we should follow these points, but there is more to say, inshallah.
Okay, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. So the approach that we take in dealing with Islamophobia in our trainings and in a framework is, and we borrow from some ideas from Andrea Smith, who talks about the 3 prongs of white supremacy. And the 3 prongs of white supremacy are settler colonialism, so this nation built upon the theft of native lands, right? And also the building of this country on the enslavement of African peoples, and so the theft, like the exploitation of black labor, which still continues both here and also in Africa in mines and in mass incarceration. And then the third is the perpetual war, right? This $1 billion, the industry of the security industry, the perpetual war now against Muslims. Before I grew up in the 80s, so we actually used to do those drills. Remember those? Like, you hide for the nuclear bombs. But, the Green Scare, and there's a lot of money with military contracting. And so when you look at, like, who benefits from white supremacy and who's harmed, and in those 3 prongs, right, like there are 3 groups that are targeted. And so for our work, we don't do as much quantitative research, which I completely value, and we're doing our work to dismantle, to confront bias. That's important. But we also look at historical text, and the impetus of all 3 is the doctrine of discovery. And at that time, they didn't have a term called Islam. They just called Muslims either Moors, Saracens, or Turks. And so we were racialized at that time. And if you look at the texts as they were talking about it, right, like they racialized Muslims, and a lot of like Matamoros, or like the imagery that they used to conquer native lands, like they used the image of a Moor, many times either racializing them to be black or definitely not European. And also tied to that, right, in this time in Portugal and Spain was antisemitism. So at this core of like white supremacy in this moment, it justified all 3, which was the taking of conquering the Saracen, of taking their land, their property, reducing them to perpetual slavery. And in that moment, it impacted everyone globally. So what our approach is, in taking that analysis, then we can build better lines of solidarity with the indigenous peoples globally, but also with Black people, with the African diaspora globally, and work to connect those with the struggle of Muslims, whether that's in the United States, but also globally. And so when we talk about why is Islamophobia is important, is that we will never challenge, we will never dismantle the atrocities of white supremacy without dealing with Islamophobia. And that's what we tell our allies, that's what we focus on for ourselves, and that also Islamophobia, we won't be able to tackle that unless we come to terms with how it's deeply tied up into the white supremacist project.
So that actually leads perfectly to my next question. We know that Black Muslims are at the intersection of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, as well as xenophobia. How has the Muslim community at large, of which a third are Black, dealt with anti-Black racism, and how can we all do a better job of building coalitions between and among these two intersecting groups?
Okay. So, we have, obviously, the first Muslims that were in the Americas were the enslaved Africans. And understanding both that history, that complex history, and the contributions of enslaved Africans in this land, including whether the history of Sapelo Island. Now we've been talking about, and I've seen tremendous shifts in how we talk about Blackness and how we talk about Islam, and honoring figures like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, and these are treasured figures within our imagination, and also within that we draw on for as we build institutions. At the same time, we still perpetuate these things as far as who is a good Muslim or not. For example, recently, when a Muslim woman, there was a Twitter exchange, and a Muslim leader who runs a very reputable organization, she was accused of being part of the Nation of Islam. And so here you position good Muslim, bad Muslim, from the same people that will just really valorize Muhammad Ali, who actually comes out of the Nation of Islam. So when we perpetuate the idea that all Black Muslims, either they come out of the Nation of Islam and therefore they're not real Muslims, they don't deserve the same types of protections, they're still seen as radical Muslims and not, people that we distance ourselves. And in that moment, I saw the ways in which she was othered as a Muslim. Her rights were disrespected, her rights were violated as a Muslim, and that destroys lines of solidarity. So one of the first things that we can do is be bystander anti-racist. When you see discrimination against a Black Muslim, when you have someone ask a Black Muslim to, and this has happened to me in the past where people ask me to actually read text, say my shahada, can you say that? Because are you sure you're really Muslim? That we have to be bystanders and do something about that and challenge that bias. Part of that idea, it's also not only just tied to the Nation of Islam, but these are perpetuated during colonial times, this idea of Islam noir, which is that African Muslims are not as Muslim as Middle East Muslims. And that perpetuates globally, the French were known for doing that, the British did it, and this is also perpetuated now in certain discourses when they talk about Black Muslims, which includes framing them as jihadis in the hood, as jailbird jihadis, as Black Muslim women as seen as burqa bandits. There's so many tropes that target the Somali community, tropes that target the West African community. And I think that it's very important that as we talk about Islamophobia, as we do our type of activism, that we look at how both anti-Black racism, which means that Black Muslims are going to be much more likely to be pulled over by law enforcement, to be targeted, to be surveilled, just by the nature of their skin. their perceived race. And then that intersects. So mass incarceration and the security system, right, like the national security system intersects in ways that are deeply harmful. And in many of these same communities may not have access to the same ethnic network, so especially for, you have a large convert population, so having access to resources. So we have to really do more outreach to Black Muslims in general to show them how they can access resources from mainstream organizations for their rights. I just spoke with a Black Muslim who was experiencing Islamophobia from her bank, withholding money. And I told her, contact CARE. Like, I was like, do not do this alone. Because I know so many Black Muslims that will fight these fights, actually represent themselves in court. Like, they'll go to court for themselves rather than going to mainstream organizations. And what we really need to do is to really do the outreach and encourage Black Muslims to tap into those resources. But we also have to do that work in being bridge builders.
If I could give a little bit more expanding on both anti-Black racism, but also put it in a longer historical context. We often think of 1492 as a historical period with only thinking of Muslims, and we imagine Muslims to be, in essence, Arabs. But in the context of Spain, the Arab population was actually a minority group within the larger Muslim milieu that was there. Actually, the largest segment of Muslims in Spain were of what we call darker complexion. And as such, the development or the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Europe was to create the category of whiteness. In order to create the category of whiteness, you had to actually create the other that does not belong to that category. And at the time, it was Muslims and Jews that were deemed to be the others, and they were to be expelled from Europe for Europe to emerge as a Christian, white society that did not mix with Muslims and Jews. And we could still see some of this resonance in Northern European versus Southern Europeans. During the 20th century, where the United States had restrictions on the immigration of communities of color, the United States actually went to Sweden and recruited 1 million Swedes to immigrate to the United States to make America white again at the time where the fear of Chinese, immigrants from Mexico and other places. So there was a massive immigration recruitment from Sweden, which were seen to be the whitest of white. Now let me go further to the main gains of the civil rights movement, which many of us are beneficiaries of the civil rights movement. There are 3 main gains that we need to understand. One, it was the Civil Rights Act itself. Second, it was the Voting Rights Act. And the third was the Immigration Act of 1965. Without those 3 changes, we still would be living in a Jim Crow society, and many of us in here that are sitting as immigrants, we would not be here in this country as a result of this. Moving forward, this will be my last part, is that the election of Obama is very significant in terms of the changes that took place demographically in the US relative to diversity. And if you remember, Obama was attacked for being Muslim. And that was a result of polling data, not incidental. The polling data showed that 64% of the American public would not vote for a candidate that is a Muslim. And therefore, rather than attacking him for his blackness, they used his Muslimness as a signpost for his blackness. Many of those who attacked Obama saying he's a Muslim wanted to use the N-word on him. But they felt comfortable that the civil society have allowed anti-Muslim sentiments to be an acceptable discourse. And once that was made acceptable, now you get to Charlottesville where people are actually marching, holding torches, and being comfortable in using the N-word and thinking that they're defending society. So we need to understand those linkages. Trump and his coalition is not the beginning, but rather is the tail end of a wave that begins in 1964. No Democratic president have won the majority white vote in America since Lyndon B. Johnson. Just let me be very clear. No presidential Democratic candidate have won the majority of white votes since the Lyndon B. Johnson after he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So all those who have shifted, they've been working diligently to try to reverse the gains of the 1960s. Now they are in the moment where they emboldened and they want to demographically re-engineer making America white again. That's the politics behind Islamophobia, and that's why we need to understand the history of anti-blackness and be very precise so we don't actually imagine that being American is becoming white or trying to search for a white picket fence and thinking the White House is our ultimate aspiration. If you don't critique the racial matrix that is at the foundation of the American society or the Western society in general, then you have failed to recognize the foundation by which this society has been built.
Do you want to add any?
Just trying to be sensitive to the time.
Yeah.
As a civil rights activist, I owe my work, my reason after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for succeeding in what we do to African Americans in general and to African American Muslims in particular. And in more particular, I have been inspired by Malcolm X, by his courage, by what he meant to African Americans, what he meant for Islam here and Islam worldwide. So American Muslims really should owe and recognize not only the contribution, but the suffering. And they should recognize that their survival, the American Muslim survival in the United States, is due to the survival of African Americans who have lived and suffered for centuries until now. And we as Muslims, I know this is a different subject, but we cannot be true to fight discrimination against Muslims unless also we fight discrimination against black people within the Muslim community. Yeah. And rejected at home, rejected in our discussion, rejected in the mosque, reject it and fight it, even if you lose friends. I myself lost some personal friends because I stood up to some of my friends who didn't realize that they were racist. And they are Muslim and they're practicing Muslim. But moving forward, it is an important part of our community, not only should be appreciated, but they should be at every table of discussion and even deciding and planning the future of this country. Remember, they're the ones who suffered. They're the ones who continue to suffer. They're the ones who fought. And they are the ones who are making what America should be. And I, as a civil rights activist, as a Muslim, as an American, I say thank you to African Americans for who you are, and thank you in particular for African American Muslims. And remember, all the politicians in the Muslim community, the pioneers are African Americans. The first member of Congress is Muslim. The second member of Congress is Muslim. The first Attorney General of the state is a Muslim. They have taught us so much, and we have to show it not only in words but also in action.
Okay, so thank you for that, and I think it's a good place to open the floor for questions. We have 15 minutes, so I don't know if there are cards going around, but if not, what we'll do is, yeah, we have cards? Okay. So as we do that, I will ask one more question and then we'll move to the floor. Can you explain to the audience what is structural Islamophobia? This concept, a lot of times we think of Islamophobia as societal, as people being rude to you at the airport. What does structural Islamophobia mean, and how does it work?
And how to fight it.
And how to fight it. That's right. Yeah.
I think in terms of the research on the Islamophobia industry, if we want to use that term broadly, And this is as a result of research both from our group in the UK, both in Leeds and Southampton, as well as some of the work that we do here in Berkeley, is that the primary purveyor of Islamophobia in the structural way is actually the state apparatus. Because the state identifies the enemy that is to be pursued. And you could see this in a systematic way in relations to the structure of surveillance. FBI research says that the primary domestic threat in the United States is white supremacist, white nationalist groups. Yet the resources of the FBI, because of state priorities that is connected structurally, is deployed against the Muslim community. So the 15,000 plus FBI agents, and I assume there's some in here, welcome. It's our tax money being used against us. All right. Those 15,000 have been deployed to target the Muslim community. And if you look at the data for entrapment in terrorism cases, that most of the cases that have been brought post 9/11 are entrapment cases. So that's the state apparatus being in there. So that's why when you go to the bank and you try to open an account and you are visibly Muslim, now you begin to ask to bring your passport. That is a structural Islamophobia that is different than individual cases of Islamophobia. The no-fly list, the VIP list, which I call it on the airport, where you get the 4 S's, that you're extra, 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 extra special. All right? That is part, super, right? So that is a structural aspect, and it feeds into the apparatus of the state, because we have a state and a bureaucracy that feeds on this structure. Now, I also include in structural Islamophobia, and we have actually a book that came out on Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries. These are, and I have actually a very specific definition of what Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries as a result of post-colonial legacy. These are elites that have inherited that process, and therefore they deploy structural Islamophobia in a systematic way. Third, also we have vested interest groups domestically that are benefiting from structural Islamophobia. And I have done, again, if you look at the primary funding of resources, I would say a considerable part of the funding to the Islamophobia industry has come from pro-Israel sources. And I think they're mistakenly thinking that they could protect Israel by deploying Islamophobia and sometimes rallying support for some right-wing groups and individuals. For example, the San Francisco Jewish Federation funded the Tea Party patriots. They funded and provided funding for Geert Wilders, who's the Dutch politician that is from a neo-Nazi group. And as such, we have these parts that are connected to the structural Islamophobia. So we need to approach it differently than individual Islamophobia, and I think those are different strategies. So for example, teaching about Islam might work on an individual or interfaith setting, but structural Islamophobia needs a policy, needs engagement, needs education, needs data, and needs constant awareness in relations to the structural Islamophobia. And again, if you want the research, the bibliography on this, I'll be more than happy to provide you later on, including, again, tax returns of companies, of organizations that are supporting Islamophobic efforts.
Anyone else want to add?
Yeah.
And how this manifests is also systemically. So this summer we did a training for open communities, which is housing. And so that Muslims in Chicago are much more likely to have subprime loans. Like, so that's, you have things that are happening within the job force, and how these kind of civil discourses, the ways that government figures talk about Muslims, what justifies these practices, and overall, like, you start to have different outcomes, different levels of, like, different disparities, and some of those, like, yes, it's difficult to challenge those just from an interpersonal level, but we have to look at policies. We have to do the research and ask different questions about how does Islamophobia show up within housing, within education, within jobs, within wealth, within how we can even move money. All of these things are impacting us in deep ways, and this is why it is critical that we mobilize and support the advocacy groups, the organizing groups that are countering that.
So let me break it down for you. I'm not going to add something or repeat what was said on the structure of the Islamophobia. You have individuals, you have organizations, but also you have government agencies. On the individual level, if you encounter any discrimination or bias or Islamophobic acts that hinders your ability to be a Muslim in the workplace and school, you should know that you're entitled to practice your faith in all these places. And if you feel you're violated, there is an organization like CARE. You should call in your city, in your state, or even at the national level. Go to the website, www.cair.com, file a complaint, follow up, and you'll get results, inshallah. On the organizational level, as Dr. Bazian said, Islamophobia is an entity, it's an industry. What you don't know is how organized, how professional, how financed they are. They have full-time organizations and they have access to hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of these organizations work full-time for nothing but to defame, to misinform, to create policies and create false narrative about Muslims. And they're dedicated, whether at the local, national, and regional level. And the sophistication is impressive. But at the same time, inshallah, they're going to fail systematically. And there is a beautiful ayah in the Quran where it says how these misguided people raise wealth and they try to put out the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they fail miserably. So I want you as Muslims, as believers, to know that they are doomed to fail. But you have to be the reason for them to fail. And you have to be organized, you have to be confident, you have to challenge Islamophobia wherever you see it in a structural and also smart manner. Let me just take it to the highest level, which is the government. After 9/11, the government felt comfortable to exploit tragedies and assign blame to the entire Muslim community instead of just blaming the ones who conducted the terrorist attack on the nation. After 9/11, the government, the federal government, created a list called the Terrorist Watch List. When Obama left office, it had about 600,000 people on it. Today, it is 1.2 million people on it. These people, they get stopped in airports. They get the 4 S's, they get the super service. They get harassed in airports, they get questioned at the borders. Not only that, for no reason, I'll cover this, but also they share this list with foreign governments. They share them with entities, including banks. Banks, in turn, they decide to shut down personal accounts, corporate accounts, organizational accounts without due process. It's just one way. They have the right, they believe they have the right to shut down your account and you have no legal recourse. And it happened to thousands of Muslims, it happened to mosques, it happened to relief organizations, it happened to individual Muslims. It's devastating. When you feel that you are helpless, this powerful entity can shut down and close your account without anything. If you send money to your family, if you send money to a legitimate organization, they feel comfortable just shutting down your business, and they do it. Similarly, when you travel, and many of you get the 4 S's, and a few, they are not allowed to fly. On what basis? The government feels that it can do this without any challenge. It happened to thousands of Muslims. So, Many Muslims called care over the time, and we used to fight this case by case. And we decided a few years ago that enough with this, we need to make sure that this list is challenged, because it is really, in fact, it is a de facto Muslim registry used by the US government, using Islamophobia. And the government agencies know that the threat of terrorism is coming from another community, from another organization, but politically they're scapegoating the community. When people are stopped in airports, whether hijabi or bearded Muslims or traditional Muslim clothing, it is designed to send a message to the public that we're taking care of business. We are targeting these people. But these people are not a threat to the national security, but they are convenient targets. And that has to end. So 3 years ago, we filed a lawsuit against the federal government on behalf of 22 Muslims. And we challenged the main national security agencies. Last year, a federal judge showed the government that they cannot just dismiss the case and allow the case to continue. This past September, the federal judge in Virginia ruled that this list is unconstitutional. And this past Friday, just 2 days ago, the federal judge asked the government to fix the list. And we know that the government is going to play around. So at CARE, we said it is not enough. We have to be satisfied that there is due process, that people who are put on the list unjustly have the right to challenge it, and they have to succeed if they are innocent. And we believe that the majority of people are there just because they're Muslim. And that second-class citizenship has to end, and we will not ask it to be a status. We will challenge it, inshallah, with every iota of our strength.
Well, that's great that you brought this up, because it was actually one of the questions that was raised. And we only have 4 more minutes, and a lot of questions. So I'm going to take 3 at a time, and then you guys can just do those as your final. One person for each, yeah. So there are several questions about local activism, what people can do in their local community to fight anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. So we could think about that. Another theme is what they can do at the state level in terms of mobilizing policies that will protect against Islamophobia at the state level. And then there's also several questions about the national level and about the upcoming election, which I'm going to save because we are about to do a session on political mobilization right here in this room right after this one. So if we can focus on what to do at the local level and what to do at the state level in mobilizing against Islamophobia and anti-Black racism.
So I'll start with the anti-Black racism. 2014, a group mainly led by Muslim women of all races, South Asian, Arab American, I'm African American. We founded an organization to address anti-Black racism within Muslim communities, and that's Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. We have members across the country, right? And there's online trainings. Many of those trainings you can study at your own pace to be able to understand how does anti-Black racism show up within Muslim communities. I encourage you all to go to our website and not just follow on social media, but for those who are committed, pledge and then join. Join, become an anti-racist leader. We often have full-day trainings. Ask your community to bring us out for a full-day training so that we can train you on cultural competency to be able to best be inclusive for Black, Latino, Indigenous Muslims. When we did that study, it was about the same percentage. 79% of African American Muslims, or Black Muslims in general, felt discriminated within Muslim spaces. 79% mixed race people felt discriminated within Muslim spaces. 85% of our respondents who were Latino also felt discriminated. So it's imperative, if we're trying to reach out and build a multiracial society, we must get this right within Muslim spaces, because because people can see our own hypocrisy, right? They could see what do our Muslim spaces look like. So there are ways that you can do this work online. We've made that accessible, but also that we do have trainers who come out across the country. We've been in 45 cities. You know, for those who are members already, thank you, Jazakallah khair, for help sustain this work. It's been really a wonderful journey, and we have much more to go, and we can get there if we try.
As far as responding to Islamophobia, and this is actually connects to the recommendations in your report in terms of building coalition, engagement, and so on. At the local level, and I think in here a number of Bay Area cities, San Francisco, Berkeley, and others, we were able to rally a large coalition specifically on the surveillance issue. Many of your local police departments have engaged and linked themselves to what's called the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. Part of it is police departments get what you call the goodies, that the federal government give them the surplus of equipment and so on. But many of this equipment that are put at the local level have surveillance capabilities, and those surveillance capabilities have third-party access to them. So what you need is to intervene at your local government level, at the city council level, because local police departments are answerable to your city council members, which means you have to understand what is the local police doing, what type of surveillance equipment have been installed, and what third-party access to that information at the local level is taking place. In San Francisco and Berkeley and other cities, that the local police can only engage if there is an actual investigation, rather than going what you call, let's go and do a blanket searching for bad people, right, type of approach, which is the surveillance tactic that has been deployed against the Muslim community. So that requires for you to know exactly the type of policies and to engage at the local level. Second, make sure that your local police is not sent abroad to be trained on counterterrorism. This is a fact that some of the primary avenues for our local police, they send to Israel to be trained on counterterrorism tactics. And as such, they come back with a highly Islamophobic infused worldview. That's a decision at the local level that you need to get in the face of your city council members, your mayor, in order to effect that this is not a place for people to go and to be trained, considering the human rights report, even our State Department reports that have actually looked at the violation of human rights in Israel. So that's another piece. Third, we have actually a report that we should have had it ready, is about public education. And I know Amina in here that worked on it in terms of how to address Islamophobia in public education. That is something that is directly connected to your local school board of education. What type of curriculum is in the classroom and what type of training your teachers and administrators get is very critical. So far, it's been other organizations that don't have the best interests of the Muslim community that engage in the training. And therefore, what we need is to be sure that we're engaging in curriculum critique and also recommendation for how to address Islamophobia at the K through 12 and education, and also through the university. So that's a very important. The third element, the fourth element of this is public health. So far, we have been focusing on Islamophobia in relations to media, critique of the politics and so on, but actually to transform and look at the victims of Islamophobia and what type of impact Islamophobia in relations to public health in terms of mental issues, as well as the public health infrastructure is not attuned to the needs of minorities in general, but more so toward Muslims. We have the case again of Susanna Barakat, who spoke about this, that as a physician, her own patient was expressing Islamophobia toward her, and she is the doctor that attempting to address the needs of the patient, and her own staff did not come to her defense. So the training of not only of how to address Islamophobia from the victim side, but also how to train the staff in public health settings to be aware of how to be allies for Muslim doctors and Muslim health practitioners, considering that's one of the sunnahs of our tradition is to be a doctor. That's a joke, right? Because study whatever you want as long as a doctor and engineer. Right? So again, this is another area. And the last, connecting to structural Islamophobia, is that we're having a whole report on Islamophobia in the gaming industry. Because many of the video games that your own children are playing are highly Islamophobic. They're using Orientalist, what you call landscapes, Orientalist structures, darker faces that are constructed in the negative. And it's not surprising that the history of the evolution of war games has highly been connected to racialization and racial epistemic. So that's another way for us to involve, which you take the data, you take the research, and advocate. Silence does not change history. You need to be vocal, you need to speak, and that's the only way that change. If you think that, again, I'm all for doing tasbih in the morning and the evening, mashallah, but after you do tasbih, get out and make your voice heard. That's what I'm insisting for people to do.
We're over time.
Yeah, okay, well, final words. Look, as the description of this session said, Islamophobia is a branch of the tree of bigotry. You cannot fight Islamophobia and win unless you fight bigotry, the other branches of bigotry. So our success is not only in our self-interest, but really a reflection of our faith, standing up for justice. When you witness any bigotry against any community, you have to show up and you have to stand up. You need not to be invited. When you see an oppression, as the Prophet ﷺ said, it's not only about the oppressed or the oppressor, it is also about you. Where are you? So when you stand up against any injustice, against other communities, automatically they will come to you, because it takes the entire community to fight bigotry, including Islamophobia.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you for being here. I want to ask you to please take